Welcome. I'm Ron James with the Center for Ethical Business Cultures, and we're excited to welcome you to a webinar focused on the topic of when values clash, understanding the values framework of a multi-generational workforce. We're pleased to have with us today Tina Decker and Philomena Morrissey Satre. They're going to be our expert panelists that will share their insights. First, a word about the Center for Ethical Business Cultures. We are a nonprofit organization located in the Opus College of Business at the University of St. Thomas. Our mission is pretty straightforward. We work with business leaders to help them build ethical and profitable business cultures. We've been around for over 30 years, and we do a lot of work with executive teams and boards in helping them to set the right tone at the top of the organization. The center provides a range of services from leadership development and training and consulting to public programs promoting ethics and values inside the workplace. We also work very closely inside the university conducting research looking at the characteristics of an ethical culture and how it actually adds value into an organization. And we work hard at partnering with faculty to help educate the next generation of leaders coming into the workplace. Well, today our focus is on looking at generational differences in the workplace. And I'm pleased that we've got two expert panelists to join us to introduce them. First of all, it's Tina Decker. Tina is the Vice President of Global Organizational Culture for Best Buy. In this role, she oversees employee relations, human capital metrics, enterprise training, and global change management. She also focuses on diversity and inclusion. She's led Best Buy to an all-time low turnover rate of 38% in the United States and really helps the organization on focusing on employing a highly engaged, productive workforce. She's been very active civically, and she earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Texas at Dallas, majoring in psychology and cognitive neuroscience, and she holds a master's degree in psychology and a doctorate in clinical psychology. Welcome, Tina. Also joining us is Philomena Morrissey Satre. Philomena is the Vice President for the Great Lakes Region, Diversity and Inclusion for the Wells Fargo Company. She has been active in a number of circles with Wells Fargo, but today is actively engaged with over 52 diversity and inclusion networks and 25 diversity councils in the Great Lakes region. She served as an outreach coordinator for her company in the Twin Cities region as well. She is a committed leader inside the community. She serves on the advisory boards of the Goodwill, Easter Seals, Employment Action Center, and Clues. She graduated from the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse with a degree in public administration and political science and earned her Master of Arts in Organizational Leadership from the College of St. Catherine's in St. Paul. Welcome, Philomena. And Philomena, why don't we begin with you?
Well, thank you very much, Ron, for inviting me to be a part of the conversation today. I'm going to talk about this first slide that's up here, multiple generations at work, and why is this important. First of all, let me go through and just talk about the language on the slide, and then I'll talk about why it's important. So you can see the traditionalist generation, also known as the silent generation or sometimes referred to as the veterans generation. Fairly large, 75 million. Next is the baby boomers. I haven't heard any other names or references with the baby boomers other than baby boomers. Very large generation, 80 million. So we need to pay attention to that size, and I'll come back to that. Generation X, Xers, 46 million. And then the last generation, millennials, also referred to as Generation Y. You may hear those terms used interchangeably. The reason why we're concerned about it at Wells Fargo, and we do a lot of work around it, is number one, we want to serve our customers. So we want to make sure that and I work on the retail side of the bank, that we understand who's coming into our stores and how to best serve them depending upon their generation. Each generation has unique differences. Additionally, from a team member perspective, from a recruitment, retention, career advancement perspective, and I'm certain that all organizations, have a need to learn more, open up the conversation with these 4 groups.
Okay. Let's keep going and talk a little bit about this whole generational understanding, and why is it critical now? Does it really make a difference now? Maybe you can continue to tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, sure. And I think that, it says retiring baby boomers, 75 million. And depending upon your industry, this may be more significant than others, depending upon the age of the population that work for you. So for example, at Wells Fargo, 21% of our workforce in retail banking in our Great Lakes region are boomers. However, I just met with a government group, and they had a significant portion of their population that will be retiring. So that's a piece. And then if you look at the Generation X that follows the baby boomers, it's small. It's almost half the size of the baby boom generation. So that makes a difference. I don't know that we felt the impact is great because of what's happened with the economy. And so I think that that's a factor. Another thing to be thinking about is, there's this large group of baby boomers that are expected to retire. However, because of the economy, because of the motivation of the baby boomers, I don't think we're going to see retirement like we've seen retirement with the previous generation of traditionalists. Many boomers are going to be working longer by choice because they want to, or looking at different careers, and what does that look like, or by circumstance with the economy. So that's a piece. Another is millennials, and I've heard all sorts of different statistics about millennials. They always have their resume ready to go. They're continually looking for a job even when they have a job, and so that retention piece is much more challenging. So companies have to be in tune with this segment of the workforce.
And so why should companies learn about these generations? Why is it, keep going with why it's important for them, please, Philomena.
Okay, so this is the first time in the workplace that we've actually had 4 generations working together, which is unique and different. And we're going to be learning today as we go through the different generations that each generation has unique characteristics. We're going to be sharing some background as to what that looks like. However, we also want you to remember that every generation is unique, and every person is unique, so they may affiliate with the generation because they're born in that time frame. However, we can't assume that everyone falls in line. So that's a piece. Another one is just because of, and Ron alluded to this a little bit earlier, the values that each generation has, what's important to one generation may be different than another. Attitudes, biases, and then we also will layer on top of that cultural differences. And so that may be different for someone who is a new American, immigrant, refugee working here in our country. And Tina's going to talk about the global piece of generational diversity.
Yeah, so it's gotten a lot more complex.
Correct.
For a leader because it's not a one-size-fits-all. You've got to understand these unique segments and how to lead there, and how can you build a culture that's values-based, that's open enough where people can find out how they can connect and fit. Okay. Well, let's go a little bit deeper and look at them. And I'm going to turn to Tina now and maybe ask if Tina wouldn't take one. And let's drill down just a little bit deeper and see if we can understand what are some of the key themes in the traditionalist group.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. One of the things I think to remember is that the generations are affected by things that happen in their history, in the events and the technological advances. All of this really shapes the mindset of a certain group of people. And as Philomena said, there are differences within, so we don't want to overgeneralize, but there are some things that I think are really important to understand. So with the traditionalists, those that are 58 and over in the workplace, they were influenced by the Depression, by the Roaring '20s, by both World Wars, the Korean War. The GI Bill made education available to folks who had never thought about getting an education or having the possibility of that. They're impacted by commercial air travel, something that was not really available to the generations before them. Also, the big band era and kind of jazz. So there were things in the world that changed that had an enormous impact on how these people think about the world, and because of that, how they think about work. So there's a number of things that really are interesting about this group of people. So they have their core values. They have a great respect for authority. They tend to be conformist. They appreciate discipline. They work hard. They respect authority. They sacrifice. They believe in duty before fun. And they are pretty much adhere to the rules. They value logic, and they value discipline in a way that generations after them may not show or exhibit kind of in the workplace. They believe that work is an obligation. Excuse me. Their leadership style, they tend to be directive. They're very accustomed to command and control, so remember this generation heavily influenced by the military. They tend to interact one-on-one, which is distinctive, and we'll come back to one of the reasons that folks have difficulty across generations is how they communicate, what their generational style for communication is. So the traditionalists tend to be formal. They write memos. For them, no news is good news. So they don't require a lot of feedback. Satisfaction for them is it's feeling that it's work well done. They did a great job. So they get personal satisfaction from that. One of the ways to motivate them is to let them know their work is important. So they want to build a legacy. And again, this is a shrinking piece of the population just because of the age.
And loyalty seems to rise to the top as well. There's a covenant almost that exists between the company and the individual, and that becomes the nature of the relationship then.
Yep, this is a group of people who believed, at least going into the workforce, in lifetime employment, which is very different from the folks coming in today.
Got it. All right, let's keep going. Philomena, if you wouldn't keep going by helping us understand the baby boomer group a little bit better.
I will, and I will also call out that I'm a boomer. So one of the things about boomers is we're proud of our generation, and if you have this conversation in the workplace, you'll probably have boomers who will say, yep, that's me, and I'm proud of that. So as Tina talked about, the key word with the traditionalists was loyal. The key word with boomers is optimistic, and I'll talk with you about some of those different things. There were major events that happened during the lifetime of boomers, and remember, it's a pretty large age range, so this may be top of mind for older boomers, like the Vietnam War. Television, I remember growing up, it was a big deal that we had a black and white television, and when we got color, that was huge. So that was significant. There were also Watergate, and so what that did to this generation is, for the first time, caused people to be somewhat suspicious or cynical about what was happening within our government. It was an era of civil rights, and so there were huge gains that were made during this boomer generation for women, for people of color with the civil rights movement. There also was the impact of rock and roll. And so that was significant. Rolling Stones, a lot of those music groups were very popular. Some of the characteristics of this baby boom generation is idealistic, the view of the world, competitive, and the reason why this generation is competitive is because of the size of the generation. So it's significantly larger than the previous generation, so there's all these people in the workplace vying for those opportunities, career advancement opportunities. Unlike the traditionalist generation, this generation did question authority. So you can already see some clashes happening with traditionalists and boomers. So traditionalists, you tell me what to do, I'll follow my roadmap. Boomers ask why. Why is that? Or maybe challenging policies within companies. Do we need to be doing that? And so some of the assets of the boomer is they are service focused. This generation really has defined themselves by work. And so boomers are willing and have been willing to this date to work those long hours. Now, some things are happening within this generation because there's many impacts for a boomer. As boomers age now, they're caring for elder parents, so that's an impact. It had previously been called the sandwich generation, so sandwich between two generations, their children and then their parents or elder adults in their family. Now it's also referred to as the triple-decker generation. So it might be that you're caring for elder parents, your children, and your children's children. So imagine the pressure that people are feeling, and they're saying, historically, I've worked all these hours. However, there's additional demands on my life. Or people are saying, I want to work longer, but I may not necessarily want to work all the hours that I've historically done. I'm looking for more flexibility. Wanting to please, that's important. Boomers also like recognition. So as you talked about, how to motivate and how to retain recognition for a job well done, whereas the traditionalists historically were pleased that they accomplished the task. Boomers want to know. They like plaques, they like rewards, organizations that have service excellence or different sorts of ways to recognize service and sales or whatever your industry is built along. Some of the liabilities is sensitive to feedback. So we're defined by work. And with performance reviews, you may give a person, 75% or 80% is all positive. The boomer may dwell on that 20%. Well, and that's what they focus on. So having the conversation around what does that mean? What does it look like? What do you need to be able to do to improve? What do you need to do to get from one level of performance to the next level of performance? And so, and many times, boomers may want to sidestep conflict. So maybe working around that. So if there are conflicts, how do you call it out? And how do you have the conversation around that?
And when you, for a question for both of you, I guess, when you look at leadership inside the organization, executives, directors, are those typically populated by boomers and traditionalists from your experience, or is there not a pattern there?
I would say, in my experience, it's boomers. So that generation is now leading companies and countries. So they have a tremendous amount of responsibility, and it's often laced with that bit of cynicism and skepticism.
Okay. All right, thank you. Let's keep going. Let's take a look at the next generation. Tina, would you help us with the Generation Xers, please?
Sure. So the things that really shaped these folks and how they think, television was huge for this group. So the advent of Sesame Street promoted early learning. The University of Kansas did some fascinating studies about the impact of Sesame Street on kind of the mean intelligence of children of that age and found that it had an enormous impact. There was MTV, Game Boy, the personal computer. Also, this is when the divorce rate tripled. These were the original latchkey children. And because of that, it really shaped how they see the world. So they tend to be much more skeptical than the baby boomers. They are real tuned into fun. So they like to have fun. They like informality. At work, they approach work from the standpoint of eliminating the task. So they just want to be done with the task. They tend to be very self-reliant. And again, skeptical. They see work as a difficult challenge, and they want to kind of take that on as a contract. So they're highly adaptive, and they've grown up with some technology. They're not quite as facile as the millennials, although technology plays a pretty large role in the Generation Xers' life. The assets is they are adaptable and they're self-reliant because they had to be as children. They are techno-literate, so they know about technology. They do question authority. They tend to be pretty creative. The liabilities is they're impatient. So because they're impatient, the boomers often clash with the Xers. So those of us, I'm also a baby boomer, and I have Xers for children. And I read something very interesting. It said where the term "it takes a village to raise a child," what the Xers say is, no, it takes a parent to raise a child, and you boomer parents were not available. So they were very hard on parenting, on keeping work-life balance so that their children have a different experience from what they perceive their experience was. But they are impatient. They don't have as, their people skills are different. They interact differently than the other generations. And they're pretty cynical about the world.
I'm seeing a kind of a pattern emerge here where different generations, with the exception of the traditionalists, question authority.
Yeah.
They want to challenge it. And so how does a leader lead in that space when everybody's pushing back? Is there a formula that you can help us think about this morning? Is there an approach?
I'm not sure there's a formula, but I think there is from a leadership perspective, realizing that it's not personal, realizing that it is a cultural or a zeitgeist for people to question. Personally, I think it keeps us on our toes in leadership. I think it requires us to do the critical thinking to be able to answer the why we do things the way that we do them.
Yeah, so a leader has to be open to that kind of feedback because at the end of the day, it'll make the outcome that much richer because you've had people kind of testing the hypothesis and testing the conclusions. Yeah, okay.
I think,
go ahead. One of the really interesting things I think about the Xers is there to reward them. It's about freedom. It's about autonomy versus with the boomers where it's about money, title, plaques, etc. It's a very different. It's very different to manage this age group when they're not nearly as kind of wound up in that as the boomers were. What they want is freedom and autonomy.
Philomena,
I was just going to say that a dictatorial type of environment is not going to work.
Yeah, right.
And so asking for input, what do you think, trying to build that collaboration and create engagement so they agree with whatever the strategy is.
Yep, so that engagement seems to be a key word there.
Yeah, and this is a group, too, that says, tell me what outcomes you want,
Right.
and let me have the freedom to get there in the best way for me to get you those outcomes.
Great. Let's take a look at the last group. Philomena, would you help us with the millennials and understand that group a bit more, please?
Yes. So the millennials, the key word for the millennials is realistic. And some of the influences, and Tina talked about this with Gen X, is there was technology in that previous generation, but expanded. Huge. So think about all of the things that have happened with this generation, iPods, cell phones. Most millennials can text without looking, and they're very quick with that. So technology has played a huge role. Many national disasters, violence, gangs, think about some of the school shootings and things that have happened that this generation has seen. Safety is one of the top needs of this generation. And so when you think about that, how does that play into the workplace? Now, what's really interesting, too, with the millennials is many of their characteristics mirror the traditionalist generation. So many times they say that the traditionalist generation, millennials, can work very effectively together because they have some of the same values as that generation. Now, they were also raised primarily by boomers' generation. And so they were raised by parents who said, remember that idealistic framework? You can do anything. You can be the best, and I'm going to support you. So very involved. And so when you think about just the educational system, involved in the education system, involved in sports. So when I grew up, I was one of 7 kids. My parents rarely came to any sporting events. For a millennial, it would be rare that a parent or both parents wouldn't be at an event. They grew up where everyone's a winner. And so on sporting teams, when I played sports, there was one trophy. With this generation, they all got a trophy or a certificate or something. So they've grown up with that, and the education system has also fostered teamwork in this generation. So in the school system, there's a lot of projects. They're used to working together. So many times the difference can be if they go from that type of environment, grade school, middle school, high school, college, then they get into the workplace and they're an independent producer, what happens? And so how can we embrace that, or how can we create teamwork within an individual contributing type of a role? And what I've heard from our managers at Wells Fargo is when the team member gets their first performance review, many times it's devastating because they're getting real feedback, constructive feedback, and it may be the first time that they've had it packaged in one conversation. So that can be an opportunity for our managers to be aware of the sensitivity in delivering the feedback and to create that conversation. This is also referred to many times as the diversity generation. So they've grown up with diversity. And it's really interesting, since diversity is my focus at Wells Fargo, many of our millennials don't understand, well, why would we even have a department that would focus on diversity? Because they've grown up, they're comfortable with it, their classmates were diverse, they're very accepting of it. And so from a diversity and inclusion perspective, they're great people to have in networks because they get it and they can influence others. They're also really involved in the community. That's a core value. And so they like to be involved in the community. Volunteering is really important. So from a standpoint of Wells Fargo, how can we get them involved in our community initiatives? Because they may be in a job that is not the right fit initially with their entry-level position. However, if we can get them involved in projects in the community, they can fulfill that sense of satisfaction. They want to understand how their job, whatever it is in the organization, connects with the greater good. And some of the things that we had talked about in the earlier conversation, importance of the environment, importance of social responsibility, and those things are critically important because many of them have seen their parents work for many years in organizations and be downsized, right-sized. And that they had seen their parents work a tremendous amount of hours and have that happen. And so as they look at organizations, they're looking for organizations that care for people, the environment, social responsibility. So that's important. Another piece, too, for millennials, similar to what Tina talked about with Gen X, is the need for flexibility. And so that's really important because they want to live a full life. They want to have all these different things, and work is a piece of it. But to be able to do the other things that are important to them in their life, to have that flexibility in their work.
Okay, we're going to, in a few minutes, be opening up for questions from the audience. In order to submit a question, you need simply go down to the control panel. The very last button is a chat button. If you click on that button, you'll see that you can send a question in. There will be a drop-down box. You can send a question in. Please send it to David Rodborn. He's one of our panelist supporters that's in the room. He'll be collecting the questions. Or you can send it to the organizers and panelists. Either of those will get to David, and we'll be glad to take your question live. But before we go there, just a general question for our two panelists. You both work in cultures that are very values-based. You've created an environment that is consistent with the character, the very soul of your organizations. How do you address differences when people come from different generations, have different values or themes that are important to them? How do you get alignment in that? And is there tension in getting respect among the different generations because of how people may be treated? What are your thoughts about that, please?
So, Ron, that's a great question. And certainly at Best Buy, we have those instances. We talk about our values so much and are so values-driven that I think one of the things we have to watch out for is actually coding generational differences as a value issue, right? So when one of our values is show respect, humility, and integrity. So we occasionally, I will hear, well, you know, they push back and they ask questions and they, yes, that's what they do from a generational perspective. That doesn't mean they're not respecting what is going on. But it does mean that, again, as leaders, we need to be open. We need to ask for people's opinions. So I think it lives in the conversation, right? Being able to align lives in the conversation about what are you seeing, how are you coding that, what if you're wrong, how might we think about that differently? Okay. And it takes energy and time.
Yeah, yeah.
And I would just add to that what Tina's talking about is we're a financial services organization, so trust is really at the heart of what we do, and caring for people's money no matter where it falls in the company. And so really talking about our vision and values with team members from the moment they step in the door, and reinforcing that so we never forget that the customer is at the heart of the business. We have a vision and values booklet that's now online, but it lives. And it's really been the same for the company for many years, so that consistency, I think, of message, so that people can articulate that. Another thing that's really impacted our business, the financial services business, is just what's happened with the economy and the reputation of financial services. So I've been in banking for 23 years, and we've always been able to go out in the community and not really experience maybe what other industries have experienced, but because of what's happened on Wall Street, the economy, the reputation of financial services, the industry overall has taken a dip. And so it's critically important from an ethical value standpoint that we're true to that.
It really sounds, too, like you clearly have values that shape your culture, but it's about having the conversation with the group and understanding what that means to them and how can the values of the organization play out in the way that meets their needs as well. And so it's back to this notion of listening and being open to feedback and engaging in an active conversation. Yeah. So here's another question. Is there overlap between these different generations? In other words, just because I fall in that age category, does that automatically put me into the same set of characteristics as everybody else that falls into that category?
Well, so there's a term that we haven't talked about yet. It's called cuspers. So there's people that are right on the edge of a generation. So they might be between the traditionalist boomers or boomers and Xers. And it's interesting with the term is they're on the cusp. So many times they may affiliate with certain characteristics of one generation, certain characteristics of the other. Or as I've done workshops at Wells Fargo, people may say, I'm a cusper, but I really affiliate with Xers, not boomers. So sometimes it's defined. Another piece that is an impact is the cultural piece. And so from the research, it's, you know, what the researchers say is that many times if someone is a first-generation immigrant, that many times they affiliate with the traditionalist generation, even if they're millennial or Xer or a boomer, just because of the values of that generation, the importance of being thrifty, education, respecting elders, you know, all those sorts of things. So don't just assume because someone fits into the age category of a millennial, let's say, and they're an immigrant or a new American to our country, that that's where they're going to connect.
Yeah, and I would agree. As Philomena said, I think the thing that another thing we haven't talked about is what is the global impact. So is this the same for generations across the globe? And I don't believe it is, because each generation in each country or each ethnic group is shaped by their own history, you know, by their own events that have brought them to either to us or exist in a country where we then reside. And I think the challenge is certainly how do you hold your values in a different culture at the same time that you recognize what has shaped the folks that are working for you in that culture. Whether, and that could be, it could be history, it can be, you know, gender, it can be ethnic background. There are a number of things that go into that.
I have another question that's come in, but please, a reminder, if you'd like to have your question answered, please simply click on the chat button and send a message or a question off. Address it to either David Rodborn or the organizers and panelists, and we'll be glad to have your question answered live. I'd like to maybe follow up on your point you made there, Tina, just a bit, and that is this notion of globalization. So does that mean these four categories that we've looked at, are they U.S.-centric? And if I go to an Eastern culture or a different Western culture, there's going to be a different way to think about generations? What's been your experience there, please?
Yeah, so I think this is mainly a U.S.-focused construct, as is diversity. You know, so one of the things that we find is the concept of diversity isn't really meaningful in other countries in the same way that it's meaningful to us. And that might be because it's a much more homogenous in some other countries. The universal tends to be gender. There tends to be women coming into the workforce in almost every country. So that is oftentimes their challenge. To Wilhelmina's point, I think we see in first-generation immigrants very much what we would have seen in our grandparents or the traditionalists, the veterans. In other countries, it's defined by how progressive they are from a technology perspective, from a workforce and economic perspective. So I had an opportunity to do some work in India several years ago, and it's a completely different, they have completely different beliefs about aging, for one thing. Women are coming into the workforce in droves, where there's been traditionally a caste system there, which really defines how they think about work and how they think about each other. And with the advent of the call center, you had many of the younger people coming in and working all night long, so they were on U.S. time, and it was quite upsetting to the more senior people because they were very frightened that their culture was going to go by the wayside. Great respect for the older generation in India, and they tend to retire early and then live collectively. So there's so many things that go into how people interact in the workforce in other countries that we just don't have an appreciation for because they're not things that impact us in the same way here.
Yeah. So are there any challenges that you've seen, conflicts or clashes that might have occurred, and how have you helped your leaders work their way through those?
So I actually had one fairly recently with a senior executive who was an early boomer, so born right after the change of generations. And we were having a very robust conversation about the kids, meaning the Xers. And his perspective is they don't know how to communicate. He's very concerned about the company and the country because these people don't know how to communicate. And as we talked it through, I was able to say, what if they just don't communicate the way we do? And P.S., they're going to be running our company and our country, so maybe it's incumbent upon us to communicate differently. So the difference in kind of those early boomers with memos, a bit more formality, we grew up with rotary phones to start with, and one-on-one. We valued that kind of one-on-one communication and conversation. I have learned that if I want to talk to my children, I text. I don't call them on the phone because they don't answer their phone. But they will. I can always get a text back. So it's a different form of communication. And I think it's incumbent upon those of us who will be exiting the workforce first to figure out how to best equip the younger generation to be able to take on leadership roles. And more, over the next 18 to 24 months, we're going to see the Xers moving into very senior leadership roles. But I do believe that we have to just recognize that the differences don't mean right, wrong.
Yes.
The differences just mean different, and we all have to learn kind of new skills to be able to live in an environment with 4 generations.
Yep. Philomena, any?
Yeah, another clash, there's a couple of clashes that I'd like to talk about, is one around career development. And so boomers have paid their dues. They have come up through the ranks and they've done all these different positions and they're at a certain level. And there's somewhat of a conflict with millennials and Xers because millennials and Xers are saying, I want career mobility. And so the boomer is thinking, okay, well, you want to go from level 1 to level 2 to level 3, level 4, and not necessarily. What they want is they want to learn, they want to grow, they want to be challenged. It doesn't necessarily mean another promotion. And so sometimes it's really understanding what is the why. What's important to you and what do you want, and having that conversation and not assuming that we know what that answer is. Another thing that's been interesting, particularly as we've had millennials and Gen Xers coming into the workplace, things that we've historically taken for granted, for example, time. For someone who works as a teller, they have to be ready to go when their shift starts. not like 10 or 15 minutes later, and so sense of time is different, and so educating around that, around dress. So flip-flops, tank tops, some of the things that are big in this generation, where a manager's having to coach around what that, what it looks like to be professional, honoring differences, but yet having that level of professionalism when they're representing the company. So conversations that maybe we haven't always historically had, and just business etiquette overall. In the recruiting process, my favorite recruiting story, I always ask our recruiters, give me stories, tell me what's going on, because I do a lot of career workshops to educate the community on finding a job. And she said, I called this candidate for a personal banker, and she would have been a great candidate. When I called her, she was getting coffee at Caribou. And I said, is this a good time? And she said yes. And she went on to go through the phone interview, getting her coffee at Caribou. And so just some of those things that, so we just need to do a really good job as a company setting out what's the expectation coming in. And then what that does is that helps that team member save face, so they're not having these awkward or uncomfortable conversations with their manager.
Sure.
Yeah, I can think of another place where we often have conflict as well. So you think about the baby boomers being in the senior roles for the most part today. Boomers are workaholics. As Philomena said, they're defined by work. Certainly the two generations that follow that are not. Mm-hmm. And in fact, most are not willing to give up their personal life for the company. Mm-hmm. And I think the boomers can kind of code that as a work ethic issue, where the younger generation will say, no, it's a life ethic issue. My family is the most important. And it's having those two meet in a way that you get the productivity you want, and allowing people to balance the things that are most valuable to them. I think is a conflict that we will continue to have to grapple with.
Yeah. So let me change just a little bit. What about this question of ethics in different generations, a sense of what's right and wrong? Do you see differences among generations? The classic one that comes up is this whole downloading of music, as an example.
Yeah.
Is that acceptable, or is that okay? One generation will say, well, it's there, it's accessible. So
right.
Certainly it's okay to download. Another one will say, no, absolutely not. That's somebody else's materials. Tina, have you experienced that?
Oh yes, yes we have. Yes, so and I think you have a couple of generations that say it's against the law. And that should be the answer. We have laws for that, so why would we even need to have the conversation? Where, to your point, Ron, the younger generations are used to total transparency. They're used to complete accessibility to information, to music, to personal data, to whatever they want. So I think it is both a legal and an ethical issue of how do you balance the rights of the folks who are creating content with the desire that folks have to have all of it available at any point in time. I think the ethics are different how we think about them. And I think that every generation is ethical and has people that are not. So, I mean, I think there's that definition across. But I think the earlier generations were much more tuned into what is the law. What are the rules? It was black and white. And as we progress, I think we get more and more shades of gray because more and more things are available and possible from a technology perspective, from an information perspective, than were ever available to the older generation.
Yes. Any thoughts there?
I do, because I just heard of a situation recently where because technology is so accessible with the younger generations, what's put on Facebook. And so we had a situation recently where a team member had taken a picture at work and had put it on their Facebook, but because we are dealing with confidential information, problem. And so, not having had that situation, sometimes you have to figure out what is the solution to the problem when it comes up, because you can't write a policy for everything. So, then, okay, wow, so we need to start talking about, having team members understand, what's appropriate to put on your Facebook page and what isn't, and when it has to do with the workplace or if a computer's in view or things like that, how could that be perceived broadly in the community?
Yeah, and so we probably take a bit of a different tact with that. In that, for a while, we were getting about a call a week. Our ethics officer would call and say, we have another one. You know, we'd have a general manager of a store call and say they were going to fire somebody for what they put on Facebook. And it would be something like, I hate my manager, Joe Smith, store 154. So it's very easy to identify them. And our perspective, and we debated it long and hard, was no, we're not going to fire them. It is personal space, personal information, and a perspective. And we do owe them some education. So to your point, Philomena, we say, let's talk about the image that you're leaving. Do you understand that your employers in the future could potentially go on and see everything that you've written is there for the world to see? So just be careful when you're writing that it's something that you're going to be comfortable with somebody seeing 4 or 5 years from now. And we, so we do some work with Don Tapscott, who has written a lot of books about Wikinomics and you know, the new wiki and the computer. And his favorite, one of his favorite sayings is, if you're going to be naked, you better be buff. It is about, you know, if you're going to have everything accessible to everybody, you better have it tight enough that you're not going to be embarrassed, that you're not going to give out confidential information that shouldn't be out there. And for us, so much of our population is millennial. They don't think twice. I mean, this is just how they communicate. So we have coaching available, and our conflict comes with the managers who see in black and white perhaps what they're not doing appropriately, or an employee has a point of view that they can't imagine being shared. And it's then, how do you coach the manager with what is your role in this? How can you improve the workplace? How do you have a conversation about the fact that you saw this and how it made you feel, and you wonder, you know, what can I do to make that better, versus let's try to control it. Our perspective is you can't control it anyway.
Got it. The key is back to communication, and how do we make sure we're thinking about the backdrop of our culture and the values that are important, but it's being open to listening and understanding the point of view that the different generations represent, and how do we create a context where there can be this connection and there can be this alignment as well too. Well, let's kind of turn to the future. If you were going to advise our listeners as to what to think about over the next 12 to 24 months in this space, what thoughts would you have? Philomena, maybe you could start with this for us, please.
Some of the things that we've been working on and are working out successfully for us is many companies have affinity groups formed around culture, gender, sexual orientation. We also have networks that are formed around generations. And so at Wells Fargo, we have a network called the Young Professionals Network, and that encompasses the Millennial and the Gen X team member. And then additionally, we have a Boomers Network. Only 1% of our population are traditionalists, but if someone wanted to start a traditionalist group, I would welcome that. And so what that does is it really provides a support network for team members who fall into those buckets. All of the groups are inclusive, but it also helps with reminders what our companies should be doing to meet the needs of these networks. We encourage them to co-sponsor events. So we've had events around career development that have been co-sponsored by our YPN group and our Boomers group. They've also done educational programming. And regardless if you have a network or you don't, with the education piece, what it does is it opens up the conversation. So people may be learning information, but it provides a forum, or it'd be hard to go up to Tina and just say, well, let's talk about generations today. However, if you have some kind of education session, that provides that venue. Or we've had departments where they have a book club and they read a book and then they talk about it. And so I think it's that piece. Another great strategy is mentoring. And so maybe a boomer mentor, and the mentee may be a Gen Xer or a millennial, so they're able to learn some of that business acumen, some of the rules of the road, the unwritten rules, and then additionally the boomer is able to learn, wow, you know, the great value of these two generations, and they can become more savvy around language, around how best to connect to create that engagement. So those are a couple of ways that I might suggest that companies look at, you know, creating this generational knowledge.
And Pat, I'd like to hear from you, but if you could also weave into the context of your response, we know that Best Buy's got a results-oriented environment, work environment. You create a whole system inside the culture. You might talk for just a minute as to whether or not how people engage in work may vary by different generations, and does that set up any tensions? But also, as you look toward the future, again, over the next 12 to 24 months, share with us any other implications you see.
Okay. Yeah, so the results-oriented work environment is really about how people get work done versus where they sit to do the work. So the theory behind results-oriented is you can be anywhere. I mean, you can be connected anywhere and at any time. So it kind of blows up the traditional 9 to 5, which the baby boomers are quite comfortable with. In fact, they're usually 9 to 8 or 9 to 7. And one of the things that we've certainly had to coach people on and learn is how do you let go of needing to know how people get work done? How do you set the right kinds of goals? How do you set up the right kind of communication mechanisms? And we have a number of people who work remotely, so probably a third of my team does not live in Minneapolis. So how do you stay connected in a way that you're clear what's being produced and that people have a sense of community, even when they don't live kind of in the same place as the primary business is taking place? So the row has been challenging for the boomers. So it's been challenging to manage. It is not challenging for the younger generation because they tend to be able to multiplex and do multiple things at different times. What the future is going to bring is, I think, the next 18 to 24 months, you'll see more of your traditionalists leaving the workforce or engaging in work in a very different way. So replacing, kind of the move up the corporate ladder for position of power with how do I transition from that to a role of teaching or sort of enabling the younger generation. You will see the Xers move in as the baby boomers age as well into leadership roles, and I think it will have a very strong impact on how our companies are run. Row is it's an experiment and a challenge. It is a huge draw for us. So the millennials and the Gen Xers often come to us because they've read about Row and they understand they can work differently. But it's a challenge to be able to manage that in the most effective way for both the company and the individual.
So a question that's come in, and our time is winding down, but here's a question that's come in, and that's there's been talk about a fifth generation entering the workplace, those aged 19 or younger. Sometimes they're referred to as 911. Have you heard about this generation? And if so, any data on them?
From what I understand, in talking with David Stillman, the generation has not yet been named because there haven't been enough life events that have happened to name the generation. But I haven't heard that term, but I'm thinking maybe the 911 is to their parents, because this generation adores their parents and really takes into account their feedback. And there are companies, Ernst & Young is an example, where they have recruitment collateral for the team member and then for the potential applicant to share with their parents. And so that would be my perception, but I haven't heard that term.
Yeah, I haven't heard that term either, although we have a number of under 19-year-olds at work out in our store environments. And very much like the millennials, they tend to share a value system with the traditionalist. So tend to work very well with the traditionalists.
Well, our time is winding down. I'd like to say thank you to our panelists for really providing us some great insight into what's going on with these generations in the workplace, and how does one think about the culture and making sure it's inviting and receptive, but also people can get aligned so that they can make their own contributions as well. And one of the takeaways I'm hearing is it's really about communication. How do you make sure you're not only talking about who you are as an organization, but trying to understand the different points of view that come from individuals? And while, yes, we can think about these segments or these different generations, you have to kind of look at the individual as well and try and understand their unique needs. So on behalf of the Center, I'd like to say thanks to Philomena and thanks to Tina for being with us and sharing insights. Thanks to you, those of you who are in the audience. This program will be available on the CEBC website in about a week or so. We're going through the holiday period, but we will be able to get access to the technology to make sure we'll make this accessible to you within the next week. The last page actually shows some contact information for the Center. If you have a question, you have a telephone number you can reach us at, or please send us an email. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much for being with us, and our program is adjourned.